Hello everybody, I'm the Barebow Brummy and welcome to part 2 of working on arrow spine. If you followed the advice I left in the last video, which I'll put a link to up there, now we're ready to tune our arrows to our bow using the paper tuning method. Some of you may not have heard of it. It has several advantages over bare shaft tuning and tuning at your range. The main one is you don't need a great deal of space. You can do it indoors. I even know people that have done it in their own kitchen, which is quite possible to do. I would have done it outside today, but the weather's too bad, so we're back in the workshop. But first I need to explain what paper tuning is and how it actually works. You can use the paper tuning method not only to adjust the spine of your arrows to make them fly out of your bow perfectly, but also to check that your nock point is in the right position. I think we'll start with how to work out how your nock point is in the right place. I know I've done this before in a previous video, but we'll go into it in a little bit more detail. Now, as you can see here behind me, I've set up my bow and I've got this piece of paper with the dotted line on it, and the arrow is aligned perfectly straight down the dotted line. What I wanted to show you was what happens as a consequence of your nocking point being either too low or too high. At the moment, that nock point is dead right for that bow. So I've got a perfectly straight line down the arrow on that dotted line, and it's perfectly lined up. Now, what happens if I move that nocking point so it's slightly high? All I'm going to do is move this end of the arrow up 5 millimeters to there. It's only 5 millimeters higher there, but you can see what happens at this end. It's a huge difference at that end of the arrow. And what will happen is, once that arrow comes off the bow, the arrow will fly forward, the nose or the point of the arrow will become low, the back of the fletchings will become high, and it will just exaggerate itself because it'll dip forward. Then, as the arrow moves down the range, the fletchings start to try to take control, and they'll bring the arrow back in line, but they will overcompensate. So it will then go nose high, tail low, and all the way down range you'll find it'll just do this. That's called porpoising. So you need to correct it. Also, if your nocking point is too low, and I'll just pop this back on, and again I'll make it just 5 millimeters too low at the string, and you can see from that again it's way too high at that end, but there's only 5 millimeters difference at this end. It's a very small margin. Again, once your arrow releases from the string, the nose comes high, the fletchings come low like that, then the fletchings start to take over as they move forward, tries to compensate. It will then push it too high and compensate back down, and it will porpoise its way through its flight. Now, the problem for you and I as the archer is that without being able to see while you shoot, you cannot tell whether your nock point is too high or too low, because the reaction is exactly the same. The whole thing happens in a very short period. Within the first 4 feet of the flight, which will decide whether it's a high nock point or a low nock point, which is why I tend to paper tune at a very short distance. When we actually get the paper tuner out, I'll show you actually the result of having your nock point too high or your nock point too low. Now, when it comes to arrow spine, if your arrow is too stiff and you're a right-handed archer, what will happen is the arrow will want to go to your left. If the arrow is too weak or too bendy, to use another phrase, the arrow will want to go to the right. The reason being it bends too much and it curves its way around the bow. To give you a graphic example, if I point that straight at the camera, the arrow will come off the bow. If it's too stiff, it will go that way, and then the fletchings will try to compensate and it will come back again, but it will go too far. It'll do the same as porpoising, but in a horizontal position, and it will start to do this through the air. You'll never get any kind of accuracy because the point's moving around all over the place. The whole idea of it is to try to keep that point in one stable position. Also, in the opposite, if your arrow's too weak, it'll want to go to the right, which means it'll turn that way. Again, the fletchings will try to compensate for it and make the arrow wiggle through the air. That's the difference between a weak spine and a strong spine. But then again, you need to know which one you've actually got. And in the case of the paper tuning, because we do it at such a close range, the idea is that the arrow will pass through the paper while it's still pointing either that way or that way before it's had time to compensate for itself. So what I'll do in a little while, I shall set up the paper tuning device and I'll show you the physical results of actually deliberately shooting an arrow that's too stiff and too weak and a knock point that's too high and too low. Okay, so I've done a quick illustration on the whiteboard here to see what you would expect to see when you were tuning your arrows using the paper tune method. The first one assumes that your knock point is too high and the tear you will get in the paper will be the point will enter down here at the bottom and your fletchings will enter at the top, which tells you your arrow is going in nose down. So you'll need to slightly lower your knock point. This one here, if your knock point is too low, the reverse will happen. The point will go in high and your fletchings will go in low, which means your arrow is going in like that, which means you'll have to raise your knock point slightly to straighten it back out. When it comes to stiffness or weakness of your arrows, the bottom two, if you're a right-handed archer, if you're a left-handed archer, these will be reversed. If you're a right-handed archer, your point will go to the left and your fletchings will go to the right, which means your arrow will be doing that. If your arrow is too weak, the fletchings will go to the left and the point will go to the right, which means the arrow is going to do that. All right, what you're actually looking for in the perfect case will be the one at the bottom, which is called a bullet hole, which means the point and all three fletchings go through in exactly the same place. If you can reach that, that's the perfect position to be in. Sometimes you'll find that you'll get a diagonal tear, which means you've got two different things going on at the same time. You may have a low knock point and the arrow's a bit too weak, which means the tear will be diagonally that way with the fletchings down that way and the point up here at the top. So, but if you have got those two things going on, I would strongly suggest work on one thing at a time. Get the knock point correct, so then you start getting tears like these two here. And then once you've got that right, then you can start working on the stiffness of your arrow. That's enough with talking about the theory of paper tuning. So let's do it in practice. I've set up my paper tuner here. What I've got is 5 circles. One for the high knock point, one for the low knock point, one for the stiff arrow, one for the weak arrow, and hopefully the one in the middle for the perfect arrow. Let's shoot some real arrows and see how we go. I'm going to shoot 5, set 1 for each. First one will be the high knock point. What I'll do is I'll artificially put my arrow too high on the bow and shoot that one. Next one will be the low knock point. Pop that too low on the string. Next one, this arrow I know is too stiff. It's a 450 spine, so I know it's way too stiff for my bow. But we'll knock it in the correct place. This one, this is the arrow that we're going to be working on. This is the one that should be weak because it's too long. It's the right spine, but it's too long for this bow. And then, hopefully, one last arrow, which should be perfect for this bow. So it should get the bullet hole. Okay, let's bring the camera closer in and we'll have a look at it. Okay, so let's start with the arrow that was knocked too high. You can see that the fletchings went in up there, the point went in down there, which is exactly what you'd expect. Then this one with the low knock point, the fletchings went in down there at the bottom, and the point went in just here at the top. Again, exactly what you'd expect. With a stiff arrow, that's not correctly. You can see that the fletchings went in just there. The point goes in there. As I said before, the stiff arrow will go to the left. With the weak arrow, exactly the opposite applies. The fletchings went in just there, and the point went in just there, which makes it bend too much, therefore a bit weak. And finally, the last one, the bullet hole. The point went in right through the centre, and you can see if I slide this arrow through the point and the fletchings all went through. Can you just see that point all went through at the same point? Make it as near as I can get it with this bow. And that's how it works. What we'll do now is we'll work on the weak arrow. We can see if we can get it better than it was. So now I have an idea of how much I've got to cut off my arrow. It's time to put it on the bench and start trimming it down. I'm going to fast forward through that part of the video, simply because I've already got a video on my channel that shows you how I trim down my arrows, and I don't want to waste your time doing it all over again, so I'll do it nice and quickly. I'll get the suspicion that I'm going to have to do this probably twice, so I'll fast forward straight to the end and you can see the results. Okay, so as you saw from the high-speed thing there, I ended up having to trim my arrow down a couple of times to get it right. I tested it in between to both cuts, so I'll make sure I've still got a little bit more to go. And I've actually ended up taking 10mm off. So let's give it another test and see how we go. Grab my bow. I'm going to shoot 3 arrows through it, just in case. I tend to shoot 3 purely because it might be my form that's throwing the arrow off, so I just want to make sure it's not that, by getting some kind of consistent result. Let's try. That looked good. Let's get it back, do it again. Second time. Yeah. And third and final time, just to confirm everything's okay. Yeah, I can't get it much better than that. Anyway, so there you go. Arrows tuned to my bow at this distance. What I'll tend to do is when the weather improves, I'll go to the range and I'll test it at a longer distance and see if it just needs some very fine tuning again. Just a quick word on what happens if you've got to your minimum limit. If you've trimmed your arrow down to your minimum arrow length and they're still too weak, your only option is to lighten the points. If you're using a point like this, which has break-off pieces at the back, you can take the pieces out and therefore make the point lighter. That will have the effect of making your arrow stiffer still. But if you're using bullet points or screw-in points, you can't shorten those down, you can't make them lighter. Your only option is you've unfortunately got to go and buy some more points. That's unfortunately the way it is. These points you can trim, screw-ins and bullet points you can't. Anyway, that's enough for this video. I've been the Barebow Brummie. I'll put a link to some previous videos up there, probably part 1 of this and the trimming arrows one, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.